up, everybody, and welcome to Baz on Blades. My name is Baz, and I talk about blades, and today we've got a little bit of guts and glory for all of you. We are going to disassemble the Kershaw Endgame that I recently reviewed. Now, you guys that have seen the review know that there was a slight issue. Overall, very positive review for this Chinese-made Kershaw in D2 and stainless frame lock. Everything was good, fit and finish-wise, pretty typical of Kershaw in this type of build, but there was some grittiness in the pivot. So I thought maybe it had some dirt in it or whatnot. So I took it apart and I found a couple of issues I wanted to get here on camera. We're going to take it apart and show you guys what is going on with this knife. So the first thing you need to do with this knife is loosen the pocket clip just enough to move it to where it's not over this screw right here. If you take the pocket clip screws out, they are a different size than the body screw. They're all T6, but these shafts are different in some way and they will not exchange. The next thing is, if you fully disassemble this knife to where you're going to take the pivot out of it, the female portion of the pivot is captured two different ways. It does have a D-cut on the barrel, anti-rotation capture, and then the head is captured underneath this PVD coated little steel dress plate here. And be warned also, those two screws, at least in my example, are also different size and so incredibly stupidly small and short that I had to actually get my glasses and put them on in order to see what I was doing. So a ton of bullshit going on in this knife. I just guess you're going to get that type of stuff when you start piecing together so many pieces. This is like the I don't know, semi-auto pistol version of regular folding knife. It's got so many parts on it. So what we're going to do is close this knife down because it did come from the factory pretty doggone sharp. I want to show you the centering on this knife. It's centered. I can't get it aspect ratio because the camera on the phone is on one end of the phone. So it's centered. And the first time I took it apart, it was centered and it came right back to center. We're going to remove the body screws now. Because the pocket clip screws are different size, I do not recommend removing the pocket clip. You don't have to, you just need to barely loosen it so you can slide that pocket clip over and get it off of the head of that one body screw. We will change over to a T8. If I did not mention, this is T6 body screws and pocket clip screws and T8 pivot screw. So we will set that aside and we will take this knife apart. All right. So we had a couple of things, and there is the stop pin on this. The stop pin is shelved. It is shouldered, I guess is the right term. It is shouldered and it goes in one way because on the back side of the frame there is a pocket it fits down into, and on the front side of the frame it fits through the frame. Don't know why they did that either, but that's the way it is done. I guess they couldn't go all the way through on this side here because it's got all the doodaddy stuff on that side also. So I guess that's why. I don't know. Anyway, let's take a look at probably the teeny tiniest, smallest cutest little baby bunny rabbit set of bearings. These things are so incredibly small. These are the KVT bearings, which KVT apparently stands for incredibly small. They are very, very small, and part of the issue with this knife. Like I say, there's a couple of issues. The first one we will look at that was causing that sensation of a gritty pivot is this. The detent track on this blade, where the detent ball rolls, you can see plainly here, it rolls through the etching for China. Well, these etchings feel smooth to my fingers, okay? But at a microscopic or micro tooling level, excuse me guys, there is some texture there. And when your bearings are this doggone small, that contact area almost acts as a multiplier to sensation. It makes what would normally you would not feel at all into something that you can feel. So what I did was I got my Dremel out and I chucked up a Q-tip in it, not a standard Dremel tool, because I wanted something with a flexible shaft and a forgiving sort of medium on it. And then I used some Flitz, also known as Flitz, right side up, polishing compound, which you should have in your maintenance kit if you are a knife or firearms enthusiast. So what I did was I very lightly polished the detent ball track, and you can see just a little added sheen is all you can see. And I promise you, even though you can't tell the difference, that I did remove a ton of texture off of that etching, but I was not so aggressive that I damaged that detent ball path. So, issue number one right there. The next thing is this. This thing is put together sort of crazily. On the lock side of the frame, you can see a gouge in the pocket for the bearings. Now, that is, I think, the biggest issue with that sensation in this knife. And what has happened, I think, that is not a manufacturing defect. I think it is an assembly defect. Whoever assembled this knife at the factory for the first time over-tightened the pivot. And then they opened and closed the knife. And what that did is it caused those extremely small, with very small contact area bearings to score the much softer, what is basically a stainless spring steel frame. It is not hardened nearly as hard as those bearings in that race. So that scored that. And when you score metal that way, it causes displacement of the metal, and it caused a ridge on either side of that trough that was scored in it. So I came in again with the Dremel, specially set up. We don't want to do any damage. We don't want to remove any material. The damage is already done. You cannot fix that by removing material. What I wanted to do was polish just a little bit to try to take some of that gritty sensation out, and I did so on that side. Now, on the show side, if I can work these bearings off, I can't hardly even get a hold of the stupid little things. These are absolutely the smallest bearings I've ever seen. On this side, there is actually a washer down in the pocket. You can see the pocket is plain on this side. There is actually a washer down in that pocket. Let's take a look at this washer here. There is one side of that washer, and there is the other side of that washer. You can tell that one side of that washer is scored deeply, and the other side, this side, is not. So what I did was I took the washer out, I flipped the washer over, and I put the washer back on the pivot, the barrel of the pivot there. So I just instantly removed the displacement from this side. And I'm sort of curious as to why the washer scored so deeply, because there's something going on with the way this knife is made, of course, in the thickness of the handle scales. You've got a single piece on this side, okay, frame lock side, and then you've got a sandwiched, you've got a thin liner, and then you've got sort of a frame, and then you've got all this stuff that's inset into the frame. For whatever reason, that entailed having to use a washer on this side. But I am super duper surprised that that washer, it is fairly thick for its size. I would have thought that it would have been harder than it is. If I was ever going to do a ball bearing pivot knife, no matter the frame material, which if I was doing it, it would be in titanium, but I would use hardened washers for the surface that the bearings would ride on to not have this issue, to keep this issue from happening. So we put this side back in here, and we are going to take a little bit of Earl, and we're going to reassemble this knife. I'm going to do just a couple of very small drops of oil there. It doesn't take much oil. The oil in your knife will migrate throughout the pivot, so you don't have to get in on every layer and oil the crap out of every layer. So right now I'm rubbing these bearings on this cloth. I'm just cleaning them up a little bit. We'll drop that bearing on there. All right, and then I'm going to take very lightly just a couple of drops of oil there. Then we are going to, I want to make sure that I've got this clean. If you polish on metal, when you go back to clean it, you can tell. Always use a light colored rag to clean it, because you will see the residue of the polishing job. It will be a dark residue. And again, I didn't remove any metal. I just wanted to polish the tops of that etching off. So we will drop this back down on here. Again, we've got the washer on that side, and then the bearings, and then we've got the blade itself. On this side, we're going to just a couple of drops of oil there. We're going to clean this little bearing just a little bit, and then we're going to drop it on there. Alrighty then. And we're going to get, and this thing is sort of tight going back together. It gave me some problems the first time. Actually, the first time, I will admit this on camera, the first time that I disassembled this knife to do the initial diagnosis, I did not notice that the stop pin was shelved or shouldered. I don't know why I keep saying shelved. Apparently I just like that word, but it's shouldered on one side. I didn't notice that, so that was my initial problem the first time, but it's a pretty tight fit. So you've got to have everything lined up. And then we'll drop this screw in here if we can get it dropped down in there. Oh, come on. There we go. always be careful with your T6 screws. I tighten T6 screws incrementally. It doesn't matter where they are, what they are doing. I always tighten them incrementally because little T6 screws only have so much contact area with the tool itself. It's easy to strip both the screw out and your tool head. And I use Weehaw Torx bits, arguably the best available, but you can still strip one out. So first of all, I want to say all I did was tighten that pivot down by hand. I haven't even taken the play out of the blade yet. All I did was tighten it down by hand, and it's already centered. Actually, I didn't tighten. Yeah, I did. Centered. Okay. Let's see here. We need to work the lubricant through. And I just remembered I did not do something that is very important. I did not lubricate the detent ball. The detent ball is being dragged on that blade the entire rotation of that blade. So I'm going to go down in here right with my needle applicator and just put a drop of oil right down in there on that detent ball. Keeping your detent ball lubricated, especially in a bearing pivot knife, is absolutely one of the most important ways to have a smooth pivot. You would not believe how much of that feeling is actually coming from your detent ball. That's pretty doggone perfectly centered there. No play in the blade whatsoever. I'm going to back off just the most finite amount. Still centered. Let's give it a couple of flips. No, that's actually the blade flexing there. That's not any movement in the pivot. Still nice and centered. Yeah, I can still feel, I think, just the tiniest bit. Just the tiniest bit, and that's liable to work itself out. That is a vast improvement. And it didn't take any, really specialty tools. I mean, I've got the Dremel out here, but you can see this is a Chicago Electric from Harbor Freight, and it was like 28 cents or something. They sell the cheapest crap. It was like $19.99, and it came with like a little basic tool set up with some grinding tools and polishing tools and cutting tools that were cheap and need to be replaced as soon as they're used up. All right, so let's go and we will, oh my goodness, we will change this out and we will tighten that pocket clip. And I noticed that the body screws on this knife none of them had any thread sealer on them. Now, I have disassembled this knife multiple times now, and then I've carried it and used it and sat around and flipped with it and played with it, and I actually enjoy this knife. I think the overall design of the knife is, while it might be considered a little, I don't know, you might consider it a little fringy, a little gas station-y, a little truck stoppy. I just, it's an attractive design to me. I like the sort of modular, futuristic, transformer sort of look. And you can see, again, I'm going over every T6 screw in this knife or on this knife, and I'm incrementally torquing them down. I don't want to go from loose to torque down all in one movement with T6 screws. I never want to do that, ever, ever, ever. People that do that very quickly learn to regret it. And unfortunately, some people never learn that is what they are doing to strip out their screws. I have talked to people over and over and over and over, and they send me a message and they're like, God, I'm so tired of T6 screws. They strip out all the time. And I'm like, what are you doing that's causing them to strip out all the time? Because, I've got the same kinds of knives and I've not had any issues with any of the screws stripping. I very seldom have an issue stripping out T6 screws. If they're hard, put some heat on them. There might be a thread sealer on them that's a little aggressive. So there's our centering. That gritty sensation is... Now, of course, the one side of the pivot had the washer on it, and I did flip the washer over to the smooth side, but the other side was scored into the frame. So, you take what you get out of that. I did smooth it out, but it's never going to be, it's never going to be glass. Or, it's never going to be wet ice on wet ice smooth, which is, like the ultimate natural smoothness on the face of the planet. So, Kershaw Endgame, you guys saw the damage. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. I initially thought it was dirty, but it wasn't dirty at all. It's actually very clean from the factory. So I'm assuming they are assembling these in a clean area of the production facility, and that's good. I always like to see that. There is nothing worse than buying something like this and then being disappointed in it for whatever reason. So let's get all the crap out of the background so the autofocus will quit messing up. And I think we will grind to a halt here on this Guts and Glory video for the Kershaw Endgame. And you know what? I'm sort of liking this knife. As far as the profile of the knife and some design decisions and part decisions, there's very little I would have done differently. Really, the only thing I would have done differently is the type of pocket clip. Instead of just having a tip coming up, I would have had a tip come up in a flat, as I prefer that type of pocket clip. But since this knife does have a thin handle, I want to say, what was it? It was 430 thousandths, where you typically, consider about a half an inch to be the standard. So it's, almost a tenth of an inch thinner than normal. That makes that clip not so intrusive. Other than that, I can't think of much that I would change about this. It's a shame that Kershaw no longer makes high-end knives, and all those have been relegated to zero tolerance and priced so highly now that it is common for zero tolerance knives to cost $300 or more. I'm sorry. I love zero tolerance knives, and I own a couple and have owned a few. But $300, that's a little bit on the pricey side. I wish Kershaw still did some more premium American-made products like the old titanium frame locks they made. What was that model I had? The Tirade was an incredibly well-made knife, as well-made as any zero tolerance or whatever knife in that price range. Yeah, here you go. Kershaw Endgame, all fixed up, a little bit of a tune-up. Action feels better. We got to take a look at the inside of it. Keep in mind, guys, these screws, all different sizes. It seems like there's 10 screws on here and 14 different sizes. Just keep that in mind, and do not always work over a soft surface. You want a surface that is not hard, because when you drop small parts, you do not want them to hit a hard surface and bounce somewhere. You want this surface to be like a deadfall hammer. The part just falls on it and it just stops. That's what you want. So always work over something like this. And always work on your knives and enjoy them in every way that you can. Not only carrying them, not only using them as a cutting tool, not only fidgeting with them. Get into the inside of your knives and find out what makes them tick, and you will grow much deeper in your knife lore. All right, guys, as always, thank you very much for taking the time to watch one of my videos. God bless all of you, and we will talk to you again.